Imagine a church in which the majority of bishops no longer profess the full Catholic faith. This is not a hypothetical scenario invented for rhetorical effect. It happened in the 4th century, when a heresy denying the divinity of Christ spread across nearly the entire episcopate of the known Christian world. Saint Jerome summarized what happened in a single sentence that has remained famous across 17 centuries of church history. The whole world groaned and marveled to find itself Arian. Everything appeared lost, and yet the faith was saved. Not through numbers, not through the votes of the majority, through a small handful of men who refused to remain silent. By the end of this video, you will understand why that story from 16 centuries ago is returning to relevance today, and what it teaches about a pattern currently repeating itself inside the Catholic Church. Begin with the history, because the history is the key to understanding everything that follows. In the 4th century, a priest from Alexandria named Arius began teaching that the Son was not God in the same sense that the Father is God. The error sounded, on its surface, like a subtle theological distinction of little practical consequence. In reality, it attacked the very core of the Christian faith. If Christ is not fully God, the entire structure of salvation collapses, because only God himself could accomplish what Christian doctrine claims Christ accomplished on the cross. And yet the idea spread like wildfire across the Christian world. Within a few decades, a substantial portion of the episcopate had either adopted the error outright or tolerated it for the sake of a quieter and less contentious ecclesiastical life. Entire councils approved formulations sympathetic to the heresy. Roman emperors actively supported it, using state power to enforce compliance among reluctant bishops. Those who resisted were isolated, exiled, and dismissed publicly as troublemakers and fanatics, disturbing the peace of the Church. The most famous among the resistors was Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, who was exiled from his own see 5 separate times over the course of his long and turbulent episcopate, specifically because of his unwavering loyalty to the full and orthodox doctrine of Christ's divinity. From his story came a phrase that has endured across the centuries since: Athanasius contra mundum. Athanasius against the world. One man, or very nearly one man, standing against an entire ecclesiastical hierarchy that had lost its way. For years, Athanasius was slandered, formally deposed from his own diocese by councils controlled by his theological opponents, and forced to flee into the Egyptian desert, where he found refuge among the monks who had already begun forming the earliest communities of Christian monasticism. He was accused, consistently and by very senior churchmen, of being the actual problem, the inflexible one, the troublemaker sowing division within a church that his opponents insisted only wanted peace and unity. These are, strikingly, almost exactly the same accusations that continue to be leveled today against those who insist on doctrinal clarity in moments of institutional confusion. And yet Athanasius did not yield a single inch on the substance of what he believed, and above all, he never once left the church to found some purer alternative structure of his own. He continued repeating, patiently and consistently, across decades of exile and hardship, a single unchanging claim: that Christ is God, exactly as the church had always believed from the beginning. Nothing more and nothing less than the faith received from the apostles. And how did the story end? It ended in the triumph of truth. Not immediately, and not without genuine and prolonged suffering on the part of those who held fast to it. But it ended in triumph nonetheless. The faith defined at the Council of Nicaea, convened decades earlier, was eventually reaffirmed, and Arianism as a formal ecclesiastical movement gradually disappeared from the mainstream life of the Church. Hold on to this lesson carefully, because it is the key to understanding everything that follows in this video. The Catholic faith was not preserved through the 4th century crisis because a majority of bishops held firm to it. It was preserved because a faithful remnant remained inside the Church, refusing ever to abandon her, even while watching much of her visible hierarchy drift into serious error around them. Now return to the present, because that same underlying dynamic, a faithful remnant enduring while institutional silence prevails around them, appears to be repeating itself once again, and it can be heard today in a growing chorus of voices speaking with increasing clarity and increasing frequency. Listen to them one at a time, in their own precise words. The first voice belongs to Cardinal Raymond Burke, widely regarded as one of the most authoritative canonists currently serving within the Church's hierarchy. Following a recent consistory conducted according to what has come to be called the synodal method, Burke did not mince words. This entire matter of synodality, he said, must simply come to an end, and he added a reason carrying enormous theological weight. What is at stake, he said, is nothing less than the life of the Church herself and the salvation of souls. He then drove the point home with precision. There exists, he stated, no clear definition of synodality and no genuine history of the concept within the Church's own tradition. These are words spoken by a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, not the commentary of an anonymous blogger operating outside any position of institutional authority. The second voice belongs to Bishop Athanasius Schneider, and here there is a detail worth pausing on, one that almost draws a smile given everything just discussed about the 4th century crisis. He carries by his own chosen religious name the very name of Athanasius himself, the ancient defender of the faith against the Arian majority. Addressing the excommunications currently affecting traditionalist communities, Schneider warned forcefully that this represents an enormous error of excessive rigidity, a gesture he predicts history itself will eventually judge harshly. He went further still. Suppressing communities in this particular manner, he argued, is not synodal in any coherent sense of that word, given how frequently synodality is invoked elsewhere to justify dialogue and patient accompaniment. And the consecrations at the center of the current controversy, he insisted, are not schismatic in any meaningful theological sense, precisely because those who carried them out continue to profess the full Catholic faith without alteration or reservation. This is not, he insisted, the voice of a rebel. It is the voice of a bishop asking the Church for mercy rather than unilateral severity, which is, he noted, precisely what a genuine pastor is called to do in a moment of crisis. The third voice comes from Africa, from Cardinal Robert Sarah, a man widely known for prayer and deliberate silence rather than provocation or controversy for its own sake. In his recent book Looking Toward the Year 2050, Sarah employs unusually severe language. He describes gender ideology and Islamic extremism as apocalyptic beasts, forces that seek, in his words, to destroy the family, humanity itself, and the very image of God within man. And he goes further still, denouncing what he calls a paganism that has resurfaced even within the Church herself. Not paganism in the form of stone idols, he clarifies, but something considerably more subtle, the loss of any genuine sense of the sacred, a deep discomfort with revealed truth, a liturgy increasingly reduced to spectacle and performance rather than worship. And this is not the voice of an impetuous young provocateur seeking attention. It is the voice of an elderly man of prayer who has personally endured persecution in his own homeland and who understands, from lived experience, the actual cost that fidelity to the faith can demand. When a man like this speaks, it deserves to be heard with real seriousness. Here then is the chorus, its three voices sounding together. Burke on synodality, Schneider on the excommunications, Sarah on paganism resurfacing within the Church. Three men, three different continents, one shared alarm. And these three are not the only voices raising this alarm. Other cardinals and bishops, in different parts of the world and with their own particular emphases and nuances, have expressed remarkably similar concerns in recent months. This is not, in other words, an isolated eccentricity confined to three particular personalities who happen to share a taste for dramatic language. It reflects something considerably broader, a concern that appears to be emerging organically from within the Church's own pastoral experience and spreading across her hierarchy in a way that resembles a genuine grassroots pattern, rather than a coordinated campaign orchestrated by any single faction or ideological network. And here the parallel to Athanasius becomes genuinely difficult to avoid, because even in the 4th century, those who held firm to orthodox Trinitarian doctrine were not initially numerous. They were few, scattered, isolated from one another by exile and by the hostility of the ecclesiastical establishment surrounding them, and widely regarded by their contemporaries as a lost cause, a stubborn remnant clinging to a position that history itself seemed to have already abandoned in favor of the theologically fashionable compromise formulas that dominated council after council for decades. And yet they were right, and history has vindicated them so thoroughly that the very orthodoxy they defended at such personal cost is now simply assumed as basic Christian doctrine by billions of believers who have likely never even heard the name Arius. As is often observed, history rarely repeats itself in precisely identical form, but it frequently rhymes in recognizable and instructive ways. And so the question becomes genuinely unavoidable for anyone paying honest attention to the pattern now visible across multiple continents and multiple prominent churchmen. Are these the Athanasii of our own era, standing in their own moment exactly where Athanasius once stood in his? But considerable caution is required here, because precision matters enormously if this comparison is not to collapse into the opposite and equally serious error. This video is not suggesting, and will never suggest, that the Pope himself occupies the same position as the heretical bishops of the 4th century who actively promoted or tolerated the Arian error. That comparison is not being made here, explicitly or implicitly, and anyone drawing it from what has been said would be seriously misreading the argument being offered. The Pope remains the Pope, the legitimate successor of Peter, and anyone who transforms him into a personal adversary to be opposed and undermined is making an error every bit as serious as those who remain silent, purely out of institutional convenience or a desire to avoid personal inconvenience and controversy. The actual point being made here is different and considerably more subtle than a simple accusation directed at any single individual holding the highest office in the Church. It concerns the same recurring dynamic that has appeared repeatedly across Church history whenever a confused or ambiguous theological current gains institutional momentum within a given era. In such moments, the faith is preserved not primarily through the actions of the majority, whether that majority happens to be silent, actively confused, or genuinely well-intentioned but simply exhausted by institutional pressure to conform. The faith is preserved through those individuals who possess the specific courage required to raise their voice clearly, even when doing so carries real personal and institutional cost. And exactly like Athanasius in his own era, these particular men are speaking from within the Church rather than from outside her structures looking in with hostility. None of them has abandoned the Catholic Church. None of them has denied the legitimacy of the reigning pontiff or questioned the validity of his election and his office. None of them has proclaimed himself the leader of some separate and purer ecclesial structure, standing apart from the visible unity the Catholic Church has always claimed to embody. Cardinal Burke continues to serve within the structures of the Roman Curia. Bishop Schneider continues to exercise his episcopal ministry within full and explicit communion with Rome. Cardinal Sarah, now retired from active governance but still very much a voice within the universal Church, has never once suggested that the faithful should look anywhere outside the visible structure of the Catholic Church for authentic teaching authority. This distinction matters enormously, and it deserves to be stated with complete clarity, precisely because it is so frequently blurred in contemporary discussion of these controversies. Those who, disillusioned by genuine institutional confusion, choose to separate themselves entirely and construct their own independent ecclesial structures outside the visible communion of the Catholic Church, are not imitating Athanasius in any meaningful sense. They are, in a very real theological sense, betraying the specific example he actually set through his own extraordinarily difficult life. Because Athanasius fought his entire prolonged and painful struggle specifically for the unity of the Church, understood rightly and centered on authentic Trinitarian orthodoxy, not against that unity or in the direction of fragmenting it further into competing and mutually hostile ecclesial bodies, each claiming to represent the true remnant of authentic Christianity. This is the crucial theological principle that separates faithful internal criticism, however sharply and courageously expressed, from schismatic rupture, however sincerely motivated that rupture might feel to those who choose it. The faith is never saved through a simple head count of how many bishops happen to agree on any given theological or pastoral question at any particular moment in history. It is saved when someone, even representing only a small minority within the visible hierarchy, possesses the courage to speak the truth with genuine charity, while simultaneously remaining faithful to the Church and choosing deliberately to remain within her visible structure rather than walking away from it in frustration or despair. And this pattern, properly understood, should not generate anxiety or despair among the ordinary faithful who observe it unfolding in real time across contemporary Catholic media and ecclesiastical commentary. It should generate genuine hope instead. Because if this particular chorus of episcopal and cardinalatial voices continues to grow, if more bishops beyond these initial three find the same courage that Burke, Schneider, and Sarah have already demonstrated in their own distinct ways, it means something genuinely significant and encouraging. It means that the Holy Spirit has not ceased inspiring courageous pastors within the Church, even in a season that may feel, to many ordinary Catholics observing it from the outside, marked by confusion, institutional drift, and a concerning silence from many quarters that might otherwise be expected to speak more clearly on matters of genuine doctrinal consequence. There is something worth adding here about how this specific pattern has historically unfolded across the long span of Church history, because the 4th century Arian crisis was neither the first nor the last time something resembling this dynamic has appeared. The Church has weathered the Monophysite controversy of the 5th century, in which similar patterns of institutional confusion and courageous minority resistance played out across a different but structurally comparable theological dispute concerning the nature of Christ. She weathered the iconoclast controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries, in which emperors and substantial portions of the episcopate actively suppressed the veneration of sacred images, while a comparatively small remnant of monks, bishops, and lay faithful preserved the older and ultimately vindicated tradition at genuine personal cost, including exile, imprisonment, and in some documented cases, execution. She weathered the Western schism of the 14th and 15th centuries, when competing claimants to the papacy divided the loyalty of an entire generation of Catholics and left even canonized saints uncertain, for a time, about which claimant actually held legitimate authority. In every one of these historical moments, examined honestly with the full benefit of subsequent historical clarity, the eventual resolution came not through the mechanical operation of majority consensus among whatever bishops happened to hold office at any given moment, but through the patient, costly, and often initially unpopular fidelity of a comparatively small number of individuals who simply refused to abandon what they understood the Church to have always taught, while equally refusing to abandon the Church herself in the process. This is the pattern this video is suggesting may be visible once again in the specific voices of Burke, Schneider, and Sarah, three men separated by continent, by personal temperament, and by the specific emphasis each brings to his own public commentary, and yet remarkably united in their shared diagnosis that something in the Church's current institutional direction requires urgent correction, expressed through language that in each case stops well short of questioning the legitimacy of the Pope's own office, while nonetheless insisting, with real clarity, that specific decisions and specific institutional trajectories deserve serious reconsideration. It bears repeating because the point is genuinely important and easily lost amid the drama of individual controversies covered in isolation from one another, that none of these three men has called for resistance to legitimate papal authority as such. Burke's concern centers specifically on the concept of synodality itself, its lack of clear definition, and its potential to reshape church governance around a principle whose theological foundations remain genuinely unclear, even to serious theologians who have studied the question closely. Schneider's concern centers specifically on the proportionality and pastoral wisdom of recent excommunications applied to traditionalist communities, a concern rooted in his own particular assessment of canon law and pastoral prudence rather than any denial of the underlying authority being exercised. Sarah's concern centers on a broader cultural and spiritual diagnosis touching gender ideology, religious extremism, and what he perceives as a creeping loss of the sacred within contemporary liturgical practice, a diagnosis offered from decades of pastoral and curial experience, rather than from any position of open rebellion against legitimate church governance. Each of these three concerns, examined individually and on its own specific merits, represents a legitimate contribution to ongoing theological and pastoral discussion within the Church. The kind of discussion the Catholic tradition has always permitted and even required from her bishops, precisely because bishops bear individual responsibility before God for the flocks entrusted to their specific care, a responsibility that does not simply evaporate the moment a particular policy is announced from a level of the hierarchy above them. Taken together, however, these three voices form something considerably more significant than the sum of their individual parts. They form a pattern, a chorus, a shared alarm sounded independently from three different continents by three men with three genuinely distinct personal histories and theological emphases. And that convergence itself carries a weight that no single one of these voices could carry entirely on its own. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.